They thought their quiet life was safe, until one morning, an eviction notice appeared on the door of an elderly black couple who had lived in that home for decades. Neighbors whispered, the landlord pressed harder, and the couple's voices seemed powerless against a system determined to push them out. But just when it looked like everything would be taken away, a group of unexpected allies arrived, people the couple had once saved when no one else would. Who were they, and how could they possibly turn the tide against injustice? Stay with me, because what happened next will shock you. But first, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment below from which city you are watching this video. James and Lillian Carter had spent nearly 40 years building a life in a modest brick home at the edge of town. Their days were quiet but full, mornings on the porch with steaming coffee, afternoons tending a small garden that had fed generations, evenings filled with laughter from the neighborhood children who often stopped by for cookies. They were known for kindness, for opening their door when others closed theirs, and for carrying themselves with dignity despite the prejudice they had quietly endured over the years. To many, the Carters represented stability, a couple who had weathered storms and still stood strong. But beneath that calm surface, pressure was building. The neighborhood was changing, developers had their eyes on land, and whispers of revitalization began creeping through the community. What no one expected was how quickly those whispers would turn into something far more ruthless. The Carters had no reason to believe their lives would be disrupted. They paid their bills, cared for their home, and had earned the respect of most who knew them. But as history has often shown, respect alone isn't always enough to shield you from the weight of injustice. Something was coming that would test not only their strength, but also the loyalty of those whose lives they had once touched. It began with small, almost invisible signs. A notice slipped into the mailbox claiming that the property had code violations. A letter from a landlord suggesting that repairs would be too costly and that it might be better for everyone if the Carters considered leaving. At first, James and Lillian brushed it off. They had always paid on time, never caused trouble, and kept their home in pristine condition. But then the letters multiplied. The language grew colder, more threatening. Failure to comply may result in eviction. The couple's hearts sank each time a new envelope appeared. It wasn't just about paperwork, it was the quiet, calculated pressure of being told you didn't belong. Soon, strangers began driving by slowly, stopping to take photos of the house, as if measuring it for its future owner. Neighbors whispered that developers had been buying up homes on the block. But the Carters weren't like the others. They weren't just tenants, they were the roots of the neighborhood, the ones who had held block parties when no one else did, the ones who babysat children so parents could work late shifts. Yet those roots, it seemed, counted for nothing when profit stood in the way. The first official notice of eviction came on a gray Tuesday morning. Lillian's hands trembled as she read the bold print. They had 30 days to leave. 30 days to erase decades of life, love, and history. James tried to stay strong, but the weight of helplessness pressed down on him like never before. They reached out for help, to legal aid, to local officials, but doors shut quickly. Some said it was out of their hands, others avoided eye contact altogether. The couple began to feel invisible, swallowed by a system that was never designed to protect them. Nights grew restless, filled with whispered fears of homelessness, of being discarded. But what hurt most was the silence. Neighbors who had once shared meals and memories suddenly grew distant, afraid to speak up. The Carters were alone, or so it seemed. Then came the moment that changed everything. As movers circled their home like vultures, ready to strip it bare, a group of young adults arrived on the Carters' porch. At first, James and Lillian didn't recognize them. But as faces became clearer, memories stirred. These weren't strangers, these were the children they had once fostered and cared for when no one else would. Now grown, strong, and determined, they had returned at the very moment the Carters needed them most. But could a handful of determined voices really stand against the powerful forces determined to erase this couple's life's work? That was the question hanging heavy in the air as the fight for justice began. The showdown came on a blistering afternoon when the eviction crew returned, trucks rumbling like thunder as men with clipboards prepared to strip the Carters' life from the walls. James stood on the porch, his shoulders heavy but unyielding, while Lillian clutched the photo album she refused to let go. Every moment felt like the end of a story they had worked so hard to write. But then, voices rose from the street. The children they had once sheltered, now adults with families of their own, stood arm in arm across the driveway. Their presence was not quiet, it was thunderous. They held signs, cameras, and determination in their eyes. These were not just individuals, they were lawyers, teachers, nurses, community leaders. They were the living proof of the Carters' legacy, standing like a wall between injustice and the home that had saved them. The landlord's men hesitated. Neighbors began to gather, emboldened by the sight of defiance. What had once been silence erupted into chants, into the kind of noise that could no longer be ignored. Yet the landlord himself arrived, his words dripping with arrogance, demanding compliance, threatening to call the police. For a moment, it seemed the Carters' world would still crumble, that the weight of power and prejudice would crush them under its boot. But then, one of the adopted children stepped forward with documents in hand, legal proof that the eviction was not only unjust, but unlawful. Cameras flashed, reporters appeared, and suddenly the narrative shifted. What was meant to be a quiet removal had become a public reckoning. The Carters were no longer just a couple facing eviction. They were the heart of a story that was spreading fast, igniting outrage far beyond the block. And in that instant, the battle line was drawn, not just for a home, but for the dignity of those who refused to be erased. The fight did not end in a single afternoon, but the tide had turned. With the children's legal backing and the glare of public attention, the eviction attempt collapsed under its own corruption. The landlord backed away, his threats silenced by the evidence laid bare. For the first time in weeks, James and Lillian stepped inside their home without fear of losing it. The walls that once felt like a prison of anxiety became a shelter of triumph once again. But the true victory was larger than bricks and mortar. The Carters' story traveled beyond their street, sparking conversations in city halls, community centers, and family living rooms. People who had once been silent began to speak about the quiet injustices faced by black families every day, the subtle paperwork tricks, the selective enforcement of rules, the unspoken message that some lives matter less than property lines. For the Carters, survival was not just about keeping a house. It was about proving that dignity, history, and love could not be erased by greed or prejudice. And for their children, the ones they had lifted up in their darkest hours, it was a chance to return that gift tenfold, showing the world what solidarity truly means. This story is not just theirs, it belongs to all of us. Because every time injustice tries to push someone out, it asks us a question. Will we look away, or will we stand up? So I'll leave you with this. What would you do if it was your neighbor, your friend, your family facing the same injustice? Would you stay silent, or would you become the voice that turns the tide?